Okay, thanks for the opportunity to bring my perspective here. Today, what I'm wanting to talk about is the interface between disability sport and society's appreciation of disability or perception of disability, and how each have changed the other. In order to look forward, though, we need to look back. And what I want to start out with is looking at that a medical model of disability, which we can say was generated or started just after World War II. I was actually born during the dependency model. I got polio living in Sierra Leone, West Africa, now the heart of Ebola. I got polio when I was 3, and myself and my father moved to England. And the point of that story is that I attended the Chailey Heritage Craft School for Crippled Children. And in that story, it shows how disability was seen at that time. So it was a craft school for crippled children, so that children there could be trained to do a craft, shoemaking, that kind of thing, in order to get gainful employment. And early wheelchair technology, as an example, reflected that disability model. Not very functional, out of the medical environment. And when we look at early prosthesis, as we see here, these aren't generated for the benefit of the people with disabilities. I suggest to you that these are more generated to make able-bodied people feel more comfortable being around people with disabilities. Fortunately, we moved around about the mid-1970s to taking a more functional model of disability. The trouble with that is that our aspiration was for normalization. Normalization being the closer to able-bodied, the better. An example of normalization, I can kind of stagger up on braces and crutches, and none of my students would have ever seen me like that because I can't do anything on braces and crutches. But when someone without a disability sees me up on braces and crutches, I get a comment something like, "Oh, you're getting better," or "You're getting more normal." And there I am with both my arms occupied, not being able to move more than about 20 meters independently, completely unable to cook anything or make tea. And I'm thinking, yeah, this is better. That's because being judged by that normative standard, the closer it looks to being able-bodied, the better. Fortunately, with our functional model of disability, what we started to see was people taking control of their own functionality. At the same time as the furthest distance to race in a wheelchair in international competition was 100 meters, back in 1975, a guy called Bob Hall entered the Boston Marathon in a wheelchair that hopefully you can see up there, that still looks very much like a wheelchair, and completed it in 4 hours. Nothing to write home about. But as we started seeing function taking over, we started seeing the development in wheelchair sport of very specific wheelchair-oriented equipment. This, for example, is a racing wheelchair. Looks nothing like a regular wheelchair, and in fact, it doesn't function like a regular wheelchair. The only thing this wheelchair can do is go forward very, very quickly. But designed for that purpose, it's an incredibly efficient piece of technology that I'll come back to in a little bit. Here you see one of the ultimates of functional definition, and this is a sled hockey sled used to play ice hockey at Paralympic competition. You'll notice one thing strange about this wheelchair: doesn't have any wheels. So we've evolved function to the point where sometimes wheelchairs don't have wheels. Moving over to amputee sport, my first contact was in 1988 when I was at the Seoul Paralympic Games racing for the USA. This guy, Dennis Erler, was racing for the USA, and it was the first time I saw a truly functional item of prosthetic equipment. If you can notice his leg there in this image, his right leg is artificial, and if you can maybe get a look at his foot is actually planted down. And when you see him go to the line, he would have to limp to the line because it was only an efficient prosthetic when he was running, because his foot was set in a running position. But with that functional prosthetic, and note that it doesn't look like a leg, it's not designed to look like a leg, it's designed to have someone running quickly, running fast, very efficiently. And Ola did that and got easily held the world record for running for an athlete with an amputation. But Ola got out-technologicked by a guy called Tony Voltenpest. And what's cool about Tony Voltenpest was that he was a double leg, below knee amputee sprinter. Traditionally, the conception is losing both legs is a greater disability than only losing one leg. We have classification systems to cover that. But what Voltenpest thought was, okay, if I don't have either leg, I can make my legs as long as I want. Consequently, increasing his stride length. And here you see Voltenpest beating Ola in a race, and Ola called foul. So now we have someone who's more disabled than his competitor gaining an advantage from his disability. Ultimately, we put in regulations with regard to that. I mentioned normalization. You also have the tyranny of normative thought. Normative thought is that we people with disabilities, poor us, we're always at a disadvantage. And I'll give you an illustration of that. If I told you that I was going to give you $1 million tomorrow if you got this question right, or I'd shoot you if you got this question wrong, so don't pretend, would you select my left hand or my right hand as representing a person with a disability? I think you'd all pick the right hand, correct? Tell me I'm wrong. I'm right, aren't I? That's the social construction of disability. We are less than when compared to a normative standard. And that's what gets brought in regularly. And so we see athletes like Jim Abbott here, who pitched for 10 years in the major leagues, and he only had one hand. So what did they do as soon as they saw Jim Abbott, the pitcher, coming up to pitch? Let's bunt. He's only got one hand. Normative attitude. Who in this world do you think has had more experiences fielding bunts than somebody who's only grown up with one hand and is now pitching in the major leagues? If they switched their heads on, they must have understood. He had to be expert at fielding bunts, or he wouldn't have pitched in the major leagues. They were still bunting on him in his 10th year in the major leagues. And here's an image of him after pitching a no-hitter for the New York Yankees. But you can see how normative thinking advantaged him. We have here an athlete called Tony Robles, who won the collegiate wrestling championship a few years ago. And this image shows him with everyone standing up and applauding his victory. Because my goodness gracious me, how brave is this individual? Only has one leg, and here he is winning a national wrestling championship. Well, I'm sorry, Tony, but you were a benefactor of normative thinking. Think about this. He has so many advantages relative to the people he was setting up to wrestle against. He has only 3 limbs. How many times were his opponents wrestling against somebody with only 3 limbs? Plus, he only had 1 leg. That meant that he didn't have the weight of his second leg. Consequently, his official weight was 125 pounds, and he should have been wrestling at a weight division of 157 pounds. So consequently, the people who were facing him were smaller than him and had no experience wrestling this larger person with only one leg. Normative thinking stopped them saying, hang on, does this guy have an advantage? There are a few people who have thrown away that normative thinking. The International Powerlifting Federation, for example, now makes adjustment for lower body weight. I want to get on to my central thesis, and the idea is valorization. Valorization goes past normalization and says we should be looking at whatever it is, not as how that action compares to a normative standard or a majority standard, but how it compares and how it's of worth in and of itself. Oscar Pistorius is a perfect example of that. When Oscar Pistorius came to want to race at the Olympics in 2012, and there were many legal challenges, normative thinking led them to evaluate the Blade Runner with regard to, does he have an advantage or a disadvantage relative to able-bodied runners? And he was able to make his case there. For me, valorized thinking would be, is he doing the same act? And when you looked at it biomechanically, when you looked at it physiologically, when you looked at his split times, there's no doubt that one thing we can say about Oscar Pistorius is he wasn't performing the same act. Consequently, surprisingly enough, I don't think Oscar Pistorius should have raced in the Olympics because he wasn't doing the same thing. He may have visually looked similar, although it did look different, but he just wasn't performing the same action. So the Blade Runner and the corollary to the Blade Runner is that at the Paralympic Games 2 weeks later, he was beaten by another double amputee runner because that double amputee runner had not reduced his technology in order to be able to compete in the Olympics. So Oscar Pistorius did not maximize the technological abilities and the rules that would have allowed him to race in the Paralympics. He dumbed them down so he could be close enough to able-bodied to be able to race in the Olympics. Consequently, he lost a race in the Paralympics to another runner, Alan Oliveira, you can see here, who had maximized the rules and had longer limbs there. Question, is that technological doping? Valorization means look at an action in and of itself. There's no doubt we wouldn't say that racing wheelchairs, someone who's racing in a wheelchair is performing the same act as someone running. And they're not, because now the fastest time that a marathoner can run is about 2 hours and 5 minutes. The fastest wheelchair racer now does it in 1 hour and 22 minutes. No power, no gearing. 40 or 50 minutes faster than the fastest runner. When you think about that, for those of us old enough to recognize it, that's sub 4-minute miles for all 26 miles. Now, we should value that as an athletic activity in and of itself and nothing to how it compares to people without disabilities. I'm excited about the new wheelchairs that are showing up. And when you look at prosthetic advancements, think about the picture with the artificial arm whose wrist is not restricted by human anatomy. What happens when that wrist can turn around 360 degrees? We need something new. And what we are seeing now is the development of new technologies. As soon as we have a new technology, we have new sport. And with a combination of virtual imagery, prosthetics, we're going to be seeing very different sports in the future. And I would suggest to you that technologically, we're going to see the most extreme and best sporting events coming out of the disabled or Paralympic sporting world. Last reflection for you. Roosevelt had to hide that he had polio, did he not? And they went through many extremes to hide his disability. We just elected a governor of the state of Texas who, in his advertising campaigns, made it very, very clear that he was a wheelchair user. He used his wheelchair as an advantage. That is our evolution. And I think if we adopt valorization, we start looking at things for the worth they are, the sky is the limit. Thank you for your time today. Sorry for going a little over.